Rushmore, a towering symbol of American pride, stands proudly against the South Dakota skyline, attracting nearly 3 million of tourists annually. But behind the chiseled faces of these revered presidents lies a far more disturbing narrative, one that echoes with the betrayal of the great Sioux nation, stolen lands drenched in the blood of their ancestors, controversial affiliations with the KKK, and disturbing ties to a dark chapter of American history. Today we confront the forgotten stories that linger beneath the surface of one of America's most beloved sculptures, the backstory. Around 10,000 years ago, Native American peoples began living in what we now call the Black Hills, an area in present-day South Dakota. This region was not just a home, but held deep spiritual significance for the Lakota people who came to dominate the area in the 18th century after displacing other tribes. The Black Hills, known as Paha Sapa to the Lakota, were revered as sacred ground. The Lakota, who formed a significant community in this region, believed that the area was central to their origin story, with the Wind Cave in the Black Hills symbolizing their emergence into the world. The Black Hills were not only a geographical landmark, but a spiritual center, and the land was treated with reverence. They called a prominent mountain peak Six Grandfathers, representing the four cardinal directions, the sky above and the earth below, symbolizing the foundational pillars of the universe in Lakota spirituality. The peace and sanctity of the Black Hills were shattered in the 19th century as white settlers began moving westward. Tensions quickly escalated as settlers and prospectors encroached upon the Lakota's territory, often through violent confrontations or coercive negotiations. The U.S. government, eager to secure land for settlers and extract resources, played a crucial role in these encroachments. Government agents frequently negotiated treaties with Native American nations, but these agreements were often made under duress or simply ignored when they became inconvenient for American interests. One of the most significant treaties between the U.S. government and the Lakota was the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie. After years of conflict between the U.S. Army and the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations, the treaty was an attempt to establish peace. The U.S. government recognized the Black Hills as part of the Great Sioux Reservation, granting the Lakota exclusive rights to the land and promising that no settlers would enter the area. In exchange, the Lakota agreed to allow U.S. travelers safe passage through the territory. The treaty seemed like a victory for the Lakota, as it affirmed their control over the Black Hills and provided a legal framework to prevent further encroachments by settlers. However, like many treaties before and after, the U.S. government had ulterior motives. The treaty included provisions that promoted assimilation, encouraging the Lakota to abandon their nomadic lifestyle, settle down, and take up farming. This was part of a broader effort by the U.S. government to civilize native peoples, pushing them to adopt white cultural norms and practices. The peace established by the Treaty of Fort Laramie was short-lived. In 1874, General George Armstrong Custer led an expedition into the Black Hills, ostensibly to scout the area for a new military post. However, during the expedition, Custer's men discovered gold, sparking a massive influx of prospectors into the area. Despite the treaty's clear prohibition against white settlement in the Black Hills, the U.S. government did little to stop the prospectors, and the region was quickly overrun. The U.S. government, realizing the economic potential of the Black Hills, sought to renegotiate the terms of the treaty to purchase the land from the Lakota. When the Lakota refused, the government took more drastic measures. In 1876, the U.S. Army launched a military campaign against the Lakota, culminating in the infamous Battle of Little Bighorn, where Custer and his men were defeated by a coalition of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. Despite this victory, the Lakota were ultimately unable to hold onto the Black Hills. In 1877, the U.S. government officially seized the land, declaring it open to white settlement. The seizure of the Black Hills was illegal, even by the standards of U.S. law, as it violated the terms of the 1868 treaty. The Lakota were left with no recourse, and their sacred land was lost to them. After the Black Hills were taken, the U.S. government intensified its efforts to assimilate native peoples into white society. This period saw the rise of policies designed to erase native cultures and identities, including the establishment of boarding schools, where native children were forced to abandon their languages, traditions, and religions. These schools were part of a broader strategy to kill the Indian, save the man, as one proponent of the policy famously put it. At the same time, native peoples were confined to reservations, where they were often subjected to harsh conditions, poverty, and government control. The Lakota and other tribes struggled to maintain their cultural practices and way of life under these oppressive conditions.
When Don Robinson first thought up his idea to create a mountain sculpture that would transcend time, he did it to bring more tourism to his state alone. That was the main goal, at least. As the father of Mount Rushmore pushed ahead with his project, it developed into something much more symbolic of not only his hometown state, but of the whole country. In other words, he saw an opportunity to make a mark on the country for good and for future generations to come. While Don was a fantastic project lead, he didn't have the artistic capability to accomplish his goal. That's when he reached out to artist and sculptor Judson Borglum, who at the time was working on another monumental project at Stone Mountain, Georgia. The amazing work he was accomplishing there gave him the idea of Mount Rushmore. After they communicated, Judson was well on board to be part of the project. Despite the increase in attention the project was getting, neither of the men knew how big the iconic monument would be for the country. After scouting many areas that would be the canvas for his artwork, Borglum eventually settled on its current location, whose rock faces were as clean and smooth as any artist could have asked for. The mountain's composition of granite, which is extremely slow in the erosion process, helped solidify this monument for the ages to come. After pulling some private investors into the project, Congress eventually agreed to match funding of $250,000 to see the art piece complete. With everything in place, from money down to the materials used, the duo was ready to begin the sculpting process. Sculpting started in 1933, where it eventually became part of the National Park Service. Borglum did not like having government bodies oversee his work, but he chugged ahead either way. He poured blood, sweat, and tears into the project until he died in 1941. Left at the decision of the government entity in charge, it was deemed complete in October of 1941 and cost a whopping $1 million to finish. The monument was deemed complete and ready for dedication on October 31, 1941. The eventual cost was nearly $1 million, which, when considering inflation, amounts to around $19 million today, a whopping 1,700% hike. While the project was rife with positivity for the country's people, much controversy and heartbreaking tragedy that went along with it were covered up. Mount Rushmore might replicate the faces of the greatest presidents in U.S. history, but its construction and commissioning speak of very different ideals these very men stood up for and spoke out against. First off, the chosen spot was considered sacred Native American land, and they did not give authorization to the U.S. government to begin constructing, but they did so anyway. Before it became known as Mount Rushmore, the Lakota indigenous people called this once gorgeous natural formation Tunkasilla Sape Paha, otherwise known as the Six Grandfathers Mountain. It was a place for spiritual practice and serenity for the native people that once prowled the Great Plains. The mountain's location in the Black Hills was also significant. According to the tribe, the mountain that was stolen was the center of the universe. It was a place of spiritual worship and where three different tribes could meet, gather food and herbs, and be at one with one another. When Rushmore was complete, it tore the three tribes apart and any faith the Native American people held in the U.S. government. To them, the U.S. would come and steal whatever their heart desired, so as long as it furthered their agenda. In 1868, the U.S. government signed the Treaty of Laramie, which gave the Lakota people exclusive use of the Black Hills. Unfortunately, the U.S. broke the treaty with the construction of Mount Rushmore, and the indigenous people were powerless to fight back. The construction location was full of controversy and has brought many protests to its borders even today. Perhaps the most appalling secret of Mount Rushmore's construction lies within the artist himself, with ties connecting him to the Ku Klux Klan on his George project. This stealing of land and imposing of local values were all the more horrendous to those who knew. A professor at Iowa State University who has studied its construction and history extensively says it's clearly theft concerning the U.S.'s own laws. Apparently, the U.S. can break its own laws, so as long as it's for the benefit of the few in power. To be fair, Borglum quickly cut ties with the organization in Georgia before Mount Rushmore. He was an artist trying to get commissions. The one he had accepted in Georgia was by a KKK-run organization. According to the organization, they are the ones who fired Borglum for his offensive egotism and delusions of grandeur. Suppose terrible people like the KKK say things like that about a person. In that case, he is either really awful or acts against the organization's best efforts. The truth is a little hazy, and the proof that Borglum himself held these same ideas is lacking. After being fired, he destroyed the Stone Mountain models and fled the state, so the organization couldn't use his work any longer. This was when he jumped onto the Rushmore project. When Robinson finally pitched the idea to Borglum, those ideas of grandeur he had in the past suddenly came bursting from the surface once more. This was his chance to create his magnum opus, and he wasn't going to let anyone get in the way. Borglum had a different idea from Robinson's initial pitch of the piece. He saw it as an opportunity to give testament to American exceptionalism. He was adamant that the art depicts presidents that have played a vital role in the country's expansion. Going through the list of perceived great people, the duo decided on the 4 presidents for particular reasons. First, George Washington would represent the country's birth. Second, Thomas Jefferson, who nearly doubled its size with the Louisiana Purchase, stood for its westward expansion and growth. Third, Theodore Roosevelt, the overseer of the Panama Canal, was a symbol of economic prosperity. Last but not least, Abraham Lincoln was selected for having fought to preserve a segregated nation at war with itself. These vital moments in time are considered some of the most outstanding achievements of American values. Though the U.S. government officially labeled it complete, Borglum had tons of ideas yet to achieve. His vision was unfinished upon his death. His initial goal was to carve and blast away the mountain presidents down to their waists. It took 16 years to complete the faces and $1 million, so you can't imagine what the remainder of the project would have entailed. As the faces began to materialize on the mountain, the artist Borglum was running out of space and couldn't complete the torso as he imagined. Instead, he would think up something even better: a secret vault stored behind the faces, set to house ancient artifacts of great power. In 1938, he began blasting out a 70-foot tunnel and vault systems into the mountain for his Hall of Records. The U.S. government was unaware of its construction at first. This was by design of Borglum. You see, for 16 years, the government tried to control his art piece, trying to cut down cost and scale. The artist wouldn't have that, so upon his death, he saw an opportunity to cancel the rest of the project. It still stands as one of the most extraordinary sculptures of all time. Remember, it is essential to separate art from the artist. In other words, the work an artist produces doesn't necessarily represent the ideas presented. When Borglum died in 1941, his son Lincoln took over the project and wrapped it up as best as he could. He says of his father, "There will never be another one like him, even me. I could never produce the quality of work my father has." After the vault and tunnels were complete, Lincoln told the government the project was completed. The tunnel that Borglum and his son had constructed sat empty for decades. Then in 1998, the National Park Service placed a titanium vault on the floor, filling it with information on Mount Rushmore, the presidents whose faces were carved there, and the U.S. history behind it. Too bad they forgot to mention many of the tragedies and dark issues surrounding it. When you try to keep something a secret, it always leaves room for the why. If you give people the knowledge they desire right away, there's typically no question in motives. Because so much of its construction was shrouded in secrecy, it has to this day been subject to conspiracy and paranormal theory. This no longer secret room isn't open to the public, but has been the subject of much speculation and was depicted in many films, including Richie Rich, National Treasure, and most famously in Alfred Hitchcock's film North by Northwest. These films further reinforce the secret theories. When Hitchcock asked the NPS to record for his film, they agreed, but only under particular conditions. It wouldn't be the backdrop of any violent scenes. The government was seemingly trying to evade any sort of attribution of violence with the monument, and that no actors would scale the faces at any point during filming. Hitchcock, being Hitchcock, partially kept his promise. For the sake of the film, he did whatever he wanted. He shot the film's violent final chase scene on a scaled replica, so realistic that viewers believed it was filmed at Mount Rushmore, and still brought the ire from the NPS back onto Hitchcock and the studio. The studio had no case, and the film was released as it was. In the decades since its first construction, the memorial and its surrounding naturescape have served as a flashpoint for the treatment of Native Americans throughout the country. The protests that ensue today aren't to have it deconstructed or demolished. Instead, the indigenous people just want their story told, and told correctly. Sure, it may have been a dark period of U.S. history, but we learn from our mistakes by reviewing them, not by dusting them under the rug. Tell the tale as it is. Sure, the facts of the presidents who are up there contributed to the country's expansion, but let's not forget the indigenous people from whom it was taken. Their stories are more vital to this country's formation than many celebratory holidays that citizens enjoy off work today. Why have their tales been cut from the history books? While they ignored the great things the Native Americans did, the NPS also ignored these presidents' heinous things to forever solidify their faces on the mountains. Roosevelt, for example, saw the dismantling of Indian Territory in Oklahoma. Washington and Jefferson both owned slaves. Yet despite these horrible attributes of these supposed great men, they refused to tell of those tales. It all comes down to saving face, and in this case, quite literally. If the ill behavior of perceived great men of the past is shattered, what is to come of the country upon which their ideals were built upon? Again, you must go back to history and learn from its mistakes, not hide from them. Acknowledge the wrongdoing and move forward so all humans have a more inclusive place to live. After all, many indigenous people's stories have been hidden or swept away in a violent history. Either way, as Americans, we should all look at Mount Rushmore and wonder what we can do to make it a better place to visit for all citizens of this new America. To hold on to ideals of the past despite revelatory wrongdoing is human regression, not progression. As you all know, humans can only walk through time in one direction, forward. As you can see, Mount Rushmore, though brilliant in its form and construction, is shrouded in dark tales and mystery. It's proof to not take anyone's word for anything, and that in-depth research should be conducted individually to form your own ideas. The entities that control these monuments have forever tried to hide the dark history that resulted in its construction, but it can't erase it. So open your eyes and try to see the world for what it is and what it can become with a bit of knowledge and application.
When it came to actually make Mount Rushmore, it was not an easy endeavor, not the least of which was because the intent of the monument was to have 4 giant stone faces carved into a mountain, which means that the stone needed to be extra strong to withstand withering, yet also be flexible enough to be carved into. Thus, the granite rock of the Black Hills was chosen. Plus, the location of the mountain in the Black Hills was perfect for people to see it from miles around. As an extra bonus, the position of the mountain itself was facing southeast, which would mean that the sun above would shine down on it for most of the day, thus allowing the sunlight to fill up the granite structure and make it shine even more brilliantly. That being said, construction was not easy. Work on Mount Rushmore began all the way back in 1927, and it took until 1941 for it to be completed. Over that span of time, 400 workers risked their lives to try and carve the faces into the stone, and when all was said and done, over 450,000 tons of stone was removed from the mountain in order to make Mount Rushmore. Despite all the danger and risk, no lives were lost in the making of Mount Rushmore, something many other monuments in those days can't say. Surely you must be thinking, they couldn't have done that all by hand, could they? And the answer is honestly, no. While a lot of specific carving was done by hand to be sure, One of the main tools that was used to shape the granite mountain was actually dynamite. That's right, they actually blasted it into submission at times. In fact, 90% of the carving of Mount Rushmore was done via dynamite. Then they did the more refined work via a technique known as honeycombing. Basically, they would drill holes into the mountain and then continue drilling those holes close together so that they could slowly chip out the rock that they needed to remove. This was a very finesse style of construction, and it worked to great effect, as you can see in the faces of the presidents. So what kind of men would be brave enough to go and climb a mountain and try to carve presidents out of them? Why, miners, of course. That's right, it wasn't a group of artists who helped make Mount Rushmore what it is today. It was actually a large group of miners. You see, the miners in question had been trying to find gold in the Black Hills of South Dakota, and eventually they were hired to make Mount Rushmore. To be fair, the overall project was overseen by a Danish-American sculptor named Gutzen Borglum, but the hard labor was done by these miners, which worked in their favor, as the miners had experience not only with stone, but with dynamite. As in the way of history, when a person that is deemed special comes around and wants to be honored, many people seek to add them to key monuments that represent greatness. Sure enough, that actually happened in 1937, where Congress tried to pass a bill stating that a fifth person was to be put on Mount Rushmore. Who was that person? None other than Susan B. Anthony, the leader of the women's rights movement that swept the nation in the early 1900s and helped women finally get the right to vote, among other things, of course. Despite it obviously not happening, this was quite a gesture, and a bill really was put into Congress to try and make it happen. However, eventually, Congress rescinded the offer and stated that only the 4 original faces were to be put on the mountain. You could say they had a change of heart, or that since Mount Rushmore was already over a decade into construction, that they didn't want to muck things up now. Either way, Anthony didn't get her face on the mountain, but could you imagine if she did? What an honor it would have been, and a symbol to all women could have been immortalized. As for the meaning of her placement, I would go as far as to say equalization, as all men and women should be treated equally. As in all things, such a project was going to cost money, especially with all the dynamite and workers that needed to be hired in order to make this thing work. But you might be surprised by how much, or rather, how little it actually cost to make. All told, start to finish, over the course of 14 years, Mount Rushmore costs $1 million to make. Yeah, that's it, $1 million. Granted, in the 1920s through 1940s, $1 million was a lot of money, especially when you consider this was when the United States was going through the Great Depression and money was seriously tight. Still though, they got it done. Now, if you were to convert that into today's figures, that would mean that Mount Rushmore cost about $14.4 million, which seems more appropriate when you think about it. When you look at the structure that is Mount Rushmore, the order of the presidents goes Washington, Jefferson, Roosevelt, and Lincoln. However, at one time, that wasn't to be the order. Instead, Thomas Jefferson was going to be first from left to right. In fact, his face was actually carved to the right of Washington, from Washington's perspective, for over a year. However, as construction got deeper, they realized that the rock wouldn't be able to last. So they actually dynamited his entire face off the mountain, then restarted the whole process on the other side of Washington. Considering some of the other monuments that have portrayed great men and women of stature, it may seem odd that Mount Rushmore actually only has the heads of these 4 great presidents, while it actually wasn't intentional. Really, at first, Mount Rushmore was supposed to have the presidents with their heads and in full torso. They even had a concept sculpture showing it off. However, funding eventually got that part of the monument scrapped, and by 1941, they called Mount Rushmore complete, and it stands as it is now because of that. In order to save the best for last, allow me to ask you a question. Where did Mount Rushmore get its name? Never thought about it before, have you? That's natural, as the name feels important, but you forget about it when you look at its meaning. Anyway, the truth of the matter is that the name Mount Rushmore came from a lawyer from New York named Charles E. Rushmore. But not because he helped fund the project or was a key worker or sculptor or anything like that. Rather, he got it named after him, after just visiting the place. No, really. During its construction, the lawyer came to South Dakota to see it, and when asking a tour guide about its name, the person said it didn't have one. So the guide took up the lawyer's name and called it Mount Rushmore. Eventually, Rushmore donated $5,000 to the project to help complete it. So I guess you could say he bought the name, but either way, his name is now as legendary as the presidents that he once gazed upon in stone.